Welcome to the APUSH Dig. When we examine the US during the Gilded Age, it's easy to put most of our attention on the big cities of the East Coast and the Midwest. That's where the industrial centers were built up. That's where the urban enclaves swelled. So much important historical change happens there. But we also have to consider how all of this political and economic and social change in the urban areas in turn created change way out in the West. And also, we should check in and see what's happening in the South during the Gilded Age. Here's the big picture to understand. After the Civil War ended, larger numbers of migrants moved to the West in search of land and economic opportunity. They were looking to escape the crowded cities, look for new ways to start life, and all of this provoked competition and violent conflict with indigenous peoples. This was a renewed period of Western settlement. The settler colonial empire expands. And in doing so, of course, we must recognize that the lands being settled by white Americans and European immigrants was the land to hundreds of indigenous nations. The settlers would have to displace the native peoples. They would have the help of both the federal government, with its new expanded powers given to itself by the Civil War, and the new industrial corporations, most notably the railroad monopolies, who were also assisted by the post-Civil War federal government. To understand westward migration in the Gilded Age, here are 5 historical developments to focus on. First, land. The Homestead Act of 1862 allowed male citizens, or those who declared their intent to become citizens, so that means immigrants as well, to claim federally owned lands in the West for free. This was an effort of the federal government to settle the Western territories, which would help put pressure on displacing native peoples and setting up the next system called the reservation system. Increased westward migration led to conflict over land and resources across the plains. This begins the Indian Wars of the second half of the 19th century. The Transcontinental Railroad was completed in 1869. The 2 coasts of North America were now linked by rail. Cattle ranching became big business in Texas, which was linked to the meat processing plants in Chicago, thanks to the expanding railroad lines. As migrant populations increased, the population of the American bison was decimated. The outcome of the Indian Wars was to force Native Americans onto reservations, which would be overseen by the federal government. This begins the allotment era. Later, the Dawes Act of 1887 will lead to further transfer of Indian land to white settlers. Another development in the Gilded Age of great significance was the populist movement. The People's Party was officially founded in 1892 as a political organization that grew out of the early movements like the Farmers' Alliance and the Grange. The Populists were comprised of Western farmers and miners and Southern sharecroppers and even factory workers, all the people who felt left behind from the industrial boom of the Gilded Age. They railed against the prevailing system, the inequality of it all, and they urged cooperation among economically oppressed peoples to secure reform. Here's some of the things that populists demanded. They wanted the direct election of senators for silver coinage as opposed to the gold standard for currency in order to increase the nation's money supply, a progressive income tax that would aid redistribution of wealth and see the tax burden fall onto the wealthiest Americans, the public ownership of railroads. They wanted for the federal government to provide loans and grain storage assistance and an 8-hour day for industrial workers. And the populists even attempt to forge a political alliance between poor whites and poor blacks. Though populists were not immune to the nativist sentiment of the era, many populists called for stricter immigration policies. We should also check in on the Southern political economy during the Gilded Age. The period of an active federal government intervention in the South, what we call Reconstruction, ended in 1877, and the South returned to semi-feudal white supremacist rule. Southern leaders did encourage industries to move production to southern centers, and railroads encouraged this, as did the abundance of available cheap labor. But the industries would not really develop in southern states until the 20th century. Southern cities did develop, like Atlanta, But the South remained largely agricultural and was the poorest region in the country. Sharecropping, the system of debt peonage, prevailed in the South during the Gilded Age. So finally, let's reflect on some change during the Gilded Age outside of the big cities. The West was quote unquote conquered in this era. The Indian Wars were fought, and tribal nations were forced onto reservations. Tribal autonomy was killed as the federal government's Bureau of Indian Affairs took control over the reservations. Then came the era of the Indian boarding school, where Native American children were taken from their families and forced to attend industrial schools that would Americanize the youth. Kill the Indian, save the man, were the famous words of one school's founder. The federal government took an active role in settling the West. This is seen in the Homestead Act, the Indian Wars, and the government subsidies given to railroad corporations. And even though the Populist Party was unable to win the White House, they did win many elected seats in western states and forced the major parties, the Republicans and the Democrats, to acquiesce to many of their populist demands.